Okay, perfect. So today I'll be presenting the final study of my PhD, my PhD has focused on premature mortality in people with severe mental disorders, and this study is looking specifically at people with schizophrenia. So I'd like to start off by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I recognize that sovereignty was never ceded, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and extend that respect to any First Nations people watching the presentation today. So to start off just with a brief bit of background, it's well established that people with schizophrenia die significantly earlier than the general population, and most of these deaths are due to potentially preventable physical diseases. And we've known about this mortality gap for decades, and it has not improved over time. And we have a general understanding of why it exists. There are numerous factors involved. There's increased prevalence of behavioral risk factors like smoking. There's factors related to health systems that affect provision of healthcare. And of course, there's the contribution of social determinants of health. However, a holistic understanding of this problem and the underlying mechanisms is still lacking. And there is inherent complexity involved with a range of factors operating at these different levels and interacting with each other. And these interactions are not really captured in tables and lists like this, which are examples of linear thinking, displaying factors as independent and equally important with sort of direct causal pathways. So to better understand the complexity of this problem, we can use an approach called systems thinking. So I'm going to provide a bit of background about that because some people might not be familiar with this methodology. But basically, we can think of a system as a collection of interconnected parts that are organized in a way that achieves something, so it has a particular function. And systems thinking is an approach that looks at how the component parts interact to produce particular behaviors or observable events over time. And applying systems perspective allows us to look at the big picture and can help us identify root causes of complex problems. And by understanding the structure of a system, which is the source of its behavior, we can identify ways to restructure it to produce better outcomes. So premature mortality in people with schizophrenia has primarily been framed in sort of traditional epidemiological terms, with a focus on assessing the relationship between independent variables and outcomes of interest. So to better understand why the mortality gap is not improving, we can conceptualize this issue as a complex system to explore the interactions between these factors rather than examining them in isolation. So after defining the problem to explore, the next step in systems thinking is called causal loop modeling. So this involves developing a conceptual model of the problem known as a causal loop diagram, or CLD. And this is a tool which enables empirical research and theoretical knowledge to be combined into a visual representation of causal relationships. And the variables in a system are usually the easiest to notice because they're often tangible things that we can measure. But in terms of actually changing system behavior, it's actually the relationships between the variables that are often more important. And when the effect of a variable can be traced back to that original variable, this creates a feedback loop. And feedback loops are really the mechanisms that create the behaviors of a system that persist over time. In terms of how CLDs can be created, they can be created using primary data such as interviews or secondary data from literature reviews, and they can be created collectively with a group of stakeholders in a process called group model building, or created just by researchers, which is what I did. I'll talk about the specific methods I use in the next slide. And in terms of why they're useful, they provide a conceptual framework that allows us to test assumptions about underlying mechanisms, interpret existing evidence, identify areas where we can potentially intervene, as well as those that are in need of further research. And it's particularly important to keep in mind that these models are simplifications of the real world, and we choose how much complexity to look at. And they can be continually updated as new information emerges and with input from different stakeholders. So in terms of the methods, the first step in causal loop modeling is defining the boundaries of the model. So my focus here was on what happens after a person develops schizophrenia and the subsequent pathways that lead to poor physical health and premature mortality in order to identify potentially modifiable factors. So this excluded biological factors and early life exposures that can contribute to both schizophrenia and physical diseases. I constructed the CLD using published literature that I identified through a previous systematic review from my PhD. And first I looked at systematic reviews and meta-analyses to identify well-established relationships. And then I used single studies to dive into like more specific variables and relationships, as well as narrative reviews to examine relationships that appear important but where empirical evidence is still lacking. I also included both quantitative and qualitative evidence, and I just want to reiterate that this approach is very purposefully different from traditional sort of epi approaches in terms of being much more inclusive. So we didn't really apply restrictions or grades to the evidence because we really wanted to capture the complexity of this problem, which operates across different domains and includes some relationships that aren't so easy to quantify. I constructed it using this free online platform called Kumu, and the relationships, the variables and connections were iteratively reviewed and refined. And in the process of trying to identify those feedback loops, we did add in some hypothetical connections, which again reflect areas that would need further research. Finally, we did hold a consultation with several experts with relevant research or clinical experience to get their feedback, which was used to refine the CLD. So now there's a video, which I hope will work, which will provide a walkthrough of this interactive online platform. So I think that's playing. Yeah. So it begins by introducing what a CLD is, why it was developed, and then it leads into this like little presentation that explains how you navigate this platform. So it provides a bit of background on systems thinking, and then it moved into this subsystem diagram. So this provides a simplified, high-level overview of the system that results in premature mortality from comorbid physical diseases in people with schizophrenia. So it's useful to understand the sort of overall scope and boundaries of the model. Next, the variables are explained. So schizophrenia is positioned as the exposure, ultimately leading to premature mortality as the outcome, and all the mediating variables are classified into these three domains. So there are individual level factors, which includes factors related to physical health or health-related behaviors. Then there are healthcare factors related to health systems and services. And finally, there are social determinants of health. And then this shows how you can click on a variable to see its definition, and there's also relevant time trends that I've added in. And here it shows how you can highlight a variable and see all of its sort of immediate connections. And next, the connections are explained. So in CLDs, you have positive and negative connections. So a positive connection, indicated by a plus sign, indicates that a change in a variable causes a change in the variable it connects to in the same direction. So for example, an increase would cause a corresponding increase. And then the negative connections, which are indicated by the negative sign, the opposite. So the change in a variable causes a change in the variable it connects to in the opposite direction. So for example, an increase would cause a corresponding decrease. And you can also click on a connection to see the evidence that it's based on, with tags indicating the type of evidence. And then there's the style and thickness of the lines actually correspond to the amount of evidence that a particular connection is based on. So there are dashed lines that indicate a connection is hypothesized or based on a narrative review. The thinner lines correspond to a single study. The sort of medium lines are multiple studies, and then finally the thickest lines are based on systematic reviews or meta-analyses or relationships that are sort of just readily apparent or readily established. And then finally, we have the feedback loops. So this is a really fundamental part of this diagram. And there are two types of feedback loops. There are reinforcing loops where changes in variables are reinforced, or balancing loops where equilibrium is maintained. And you can click on the name of a loop to read its description. So in the example shown here, stigma from health professionals reduces quality of care, leading to treatments not being offered to patients who then develop acute issues, which then reinforces stigma. So loops can occur entirely within one of those three domains or across domains, as shown here. And then you're free to explore the diagram, and reminded that the CLD itself is an exploratory exercise. We're trying to figure out which factors are important, where we could intervene, what we don't know enough about, and what other directions we should be looking in. So I included a total of 74 references in that diagram for the supporting evidence for the variables and connections, encompassing a range of study types. There were a total of 21 variables, and, oops, sorry, clicked far too many times. 21 variables, 68 connections, with stigma and social support having the most connections. And there were a total of 23 distinct feedback loops, encompassing 19 reinforcing and 4 balancing loops. And the majority of these operated across domains, as well as 5 entirely within the social domain, 2 within the individual, and 1 within the healthcare domain. And unemployment was involved in the greatest number of loops. So I'm not going to go through each feedback loop. That would be too time-consuming. So I'm just going to discuss the main sort of themes that I found. So one of the main findings was really the importance of social determinants of health. In particular, the feedback loops demonstrated the interconnected nature of social determinants and how they reinforce each other, making it difficult for someone experiencing social disadvantage to improve their circumstances without external changes, that is, shifts in public policy and social norms. We also only found 2 individual level loops. The rest involved healthcare or social domains. And this is important because the onus is often put on the individual, particularly in terms of health behaviors. So this model really demonstrates how we can't ignore a person's experiences in the health system and the social context in which they live. Another interesting finding was about metabolic abnormalities. So metabolic abnormalities from antipsychotics are frequently pointed to as a contributing factor for premature mortality, but that kind of contrasts with the fact that overall antipsychotics are protective of mortality. And this CLD showed that metabolic abnormalities didn't play a major role in the system. So, of course, they do contribute to the development of physical diseases, but in terms of system behavior, the main contribution was actually reducing medication adherence. So addressing these side effects or effects would therefore not only reduce the risk of comorbidities, it would actually increase medication adherence and then obviously the protective effects of antipsychotics. Another finding was that stigma really had a central role in the healthcare system, really demonstrating the importance of relationships between health professionals and people with mental disorders. I'll discuss a few of the implications in the next slide. A few strengths and limitations. So one of the strengths of systems thinking is the ability to incorporate different types of evidence. So research in this topic has really been dominated by quantitative studies and a lot of perspectives from psychiatrists. And in this CLD, we incorporated qualitative evidence, including studies looking at the lived experience of patients, which is often overlooked in this space. And as I mentioned earlier, the CLD can be continually revised and even contextualized to specific countries and health systems, and with input from different stakeholders as well. In terms of some limitations, I did use some studies that looked at different types of severe mental disorders together, and some disorders have different magnitudes of association with particular risk factors, for example. I also used some cross-sectional studies which are not able to show the direction of causality, so further evidence would be needed to substantiate those associations. And there were some of those connections that were hypothesized or based on narrative reviews So again, this is only suggestive of causal relationships and points towards research gaps with empirical studies needed to verify these. In terms of future research, the next phase in the systems thinking methodology is dynamic modeling. So this involves developing a quantitative simulation model where you can collect detailed data to set values for the particular variables and relationships, and then you can use this to simulate the impact of different policies and interventions over time. And we really also need more empirical research on social determinants, as a lot of the connections related to those factors were based on either single studies or narrative reviews. Finally, in terms of the implications and significance of this model, as I said, stigma was a major factor, so it's really important to be improving the relationships between health professionals and people with severe mental disorders. So this could be facilitated through shared decision-making and person-centered care, which can help build trust and make patients feel respected and empowered to take care of their own physical health. And this can lead to better self-management, which can help prevent diseases, as well as better continuity of care. So instead of, for example, visiting a GP for severe concerns, regular monitoring would be able to detect risk factors and diseases early. And of course, these are principles that are already reflected in the Equally Well consensus statement. And we do, of course, need to look beyond actions centered in the healthcare system, because one of the key findings was around the importance of social determinants. So this is where we really need holistic and integrated models of care that not only address clinical needs, but also practical, social, and financial needs. So in the UK, there's a mental health charity called Rethink Mental Illness, and they released this really excellent report on community care. So it describes how good quality clinical support is only the first step on a ladder to recovery, and the need to go beyond the health sector for people to thrive and not just survive. Of course, if we were to implement a comprehensive model of community care like this, we still need to look at the broader policy context. So for example, unstable housing was one of the factors included in the CLD, and we're looking at this current housing crisis that we're in, we need policies that are in the public interest. We need, for example, we need to frame housing as a public infrastructure rather than an investment. So overall, we need actions within the health system, as well as at the government level, across sectors, in order to ultimately reshape the system to produce better outcomes for people with schizophrenia and other severe mental disorders. So I'm not sure if I have much time for questions.
Maybe time for one quick question.
Okay.
John.
Would you just mind?
Thank you very much. Fantastic.
Keep talking.
Keep talking. Just, you've got so much stuff there, I know it's hard to do, but what was the one thing that you found that really surprised you, or that we didn't think of before?
I mean, to be honest, this is a lot of stuff that we already know, but it's just like the benefit of systems thinking is really to see how everything is so interconnected. And yeah, I think I mentioned unemployment was involved in the most feedback loops, and I feel like we often forget about the importance of these really fundamental factors. So yeah, I think that's
I just, I was reflecting on that. How many times I've written in, say that in published papers, the phrases or the words, the relationship is dynamic, complex, and reciprocal. And the first time I read, and you're quantifying them, and you're describing them. So I think this is incredibly exciting in terms of that. And I know some of the work that Alvin's working on shows unemployment not being employed. It's like the rate of premature death goes to 6 to 8 times. That, and so really what you're doing is unpacking that even more. So I think this is very exciting in terms of a different way of approaching data and consolidating down. So thank you so much. Can you all join with me and thanks.